Good afternoon. I'm Brett Ruffle, editor of Canadian Poultry. Thank you for joining us for this important webinar on phasing out conventional housing. With the new code for layers, producers have some big choices to make. Should you install an enriched or aviary system? Also, should you build a new barn or retrofit an older one? Joining us to help you with those choices are two experts from Big Dutchman, Bill Snow and Ron Wardrop. Bill is the company's cage-free expert, and Ron is the Canadian sales manager. We encourage you to submit any questions throughout the webinar, and Bill and Ron will be happy to answer them following their presentations. Please note that a recording of this webinar will be emailed 24 hours after the live event. So now I'll pass it over to Bill to get us started. Bill?
Thank you, Brett. My name is Bill. I work for Big Dutchman. I go to a lot of cage-free farms. I consult with customers and talk to them, kind of what we're talking about today, different scenarios, but certainly if we're deciding to put in an enriched system, or we're deciding to put in a cage-free system, what that barn might look like, and also the layout of the equipment in the barn and what is needed for a retrofit or a new facility. I'll go ahead, Ron.
And my name's Ron Wardrop. I'm the Canadian sales manager with Big Dutchman. My time spent working with different farms and helping them go through the decision on what's best for their facilities and their needs, whether it's a cage-free system or an enriched colony system. We look at the aspects and the pros and cons of each situation for each farm. So we want to do today is go through some of those pros and cons and look at each of the systems and help everybody have a better understanding of the decision they're about to face. The purpose of today, first of all, I'd like to thank Canadian Poultry and inviting us to present this really important information to the market. It's really important that the decisions that you make as we move forward are ones that suit you for the best of you, your situation, and your farm. Okay. We have two choices. We have enriched colony cages, which allow a much larger caged colony of birds, or a cage-free situation or an aviary, which allow birds free movement around in the system and out into the aisles.
So a lot of things that the farmer needs to questions that need to be asked and learn what are the costs of an egg production cycle. And the biggest cost of an egg production cycle is feed. And if I go enriched, if I go cage-free, how does feed affect that? Typically, a caged bird, an enriched bird will eat anywhere from 19 to 22 pounds per 100. A cage-free bird will eat anywhere from 22 pounds per 100 to 26 pounds per 100, and sometimes even more than that, depending on weather. But also there's costs in rearing. What you need to know, what is your ability to get a cage-free reared bird, or are you only able to get a caged bird, or maybe it's a cage-free reared bird but it's a floor reared bird where they have limited access to move vertically in a system up and down, where if it's a cage-free and you're putting birds into an aviary type system, those birds need to be able to move vertically up and down in a system. So where am I getting my birds? Am I rearing my own birds? And therefore, am I retrofitting a rearing barn to if you're making a decision to go cage-free, you may need to look at your rearing barn as well, either retrofitting that barn or building a new barn to fit a rearing type cage-free system. Also, your labor costs. You have labor costs with both enriched and cage-free. your labor costs for enriched are going to be a little bit the same as cage. I'm sure there's going to be some variations there. But on the cage-free side, typically where a cage producer, anyway, in the U.S., you may have one worker that takes care of, anywhere from 100,000 to 150,000 to sometimes 200,000 birds. They are walking the aisles to inspect the equipment to make sure that you don't have a problem with watering and feeding. They're also walking the aisles to look for any bird that's injured or mortality. They're pulling those birds out of the system. You're doing those same things for sure in a cage-free facility, but it's more intensive. You're in the barn in the morning when lights come on. When birds first start laying, you need to be walking those aisles several times a day to get those birds moving around. It helps you with your mislays. You're also in making sure the litter is of good quality. If it's deep, you're taking some litter out of the building. There's more labor that goes into, for instance, if you have a 50,000 bird cage-free flock, ballpark figure is 1.6 people an 8-hour day to run a cage-free facility effectively. I also want to talk about housing, and if you have an existing cage facility, can I retrofit that system or that house and put in new equipment in that house and have proper spacing, size, and not just to fit how many birds I can get into the house because this is how much quota I have. Even with an enriched system, the management is a little bit more even than cage. And the reason I say that is because your lighting is going to be different. Your temperatures are going to be a little bit different. You're still trying to get that bird to lay in the nest, even though the colony is, you have more control of the colony. You still want that bird to lay its egg in the nest. So managing the system, managing the feed schedules, it'll all play an effect on that bird laying in the nest. An egg laid in the nest has less opportunity for checks and cracks. So you get a better product, a cleaner product out of your production. So if you're crowding equipment and you're deciding to go cage free to retrofit, and if I crowd the equipment in, I can get the same amount of birds that I need. And when I say crowd, maybe that's a bad word, but you need to make sure that you have enough space to make the whole environment to where the birds thrive in it, to be the best for hen welfare. So I'm not saying to go down and tear down an old building. You may be able to use that building and get this possibly even the same amount of birds that you had in a cage facility. But typically with cage free, you're going to need a little bit bigger building footprint. It's also the only thing on here, housing and equipment. It's a one-time cost. So do it right up front. That way you're not paying for it for the entire life of the equipment that the birds are in there. If you do it right up front, you're only paying for it one time. You also have costs with vaccinations. Cage free, it's a little bit more in depth because there's different vaccinations for those birds. There's a cost to that. You also have heating, electrical costs, and there's also some others like if you have the ability to sell your manure, That can be income. So what is the quality of that manure that I'm getting out of my barn? So if you do air in your system or not. Also, if deciding to go cage free and it's a brown bird, usually you can get more for the bird after it's finished laying than you can a white bird, at least in the U.S. Ron, is that the same as it is?
We don't have that. We don't have that luxury in Canada, unfortunately. But it is how the birds act within the house, totally different with the brown and the white, and there might be some considerations there.
Is there anything that you would add to?
Just, I think the big thing is that the one thing you said, Bill, is that with the one-time cost of buildings and equipment, it's important to get it right. It's important to take the time to really look at this situation, and that's what we're here to really go through today and make sure that, like you said, let's get the equipment working for us instead of having it be a problem into the future, or not necessarily not be a problem, but not meet our needs for our particular farm situation.
So let's look at rearing a little bit further. On the left-hand side, you'll see a traditional cage starter system. Notice the aisle width of the system. It's a lot narrower than the aisle on the right-hand side, which is a cage-free rearing system. Now, I know some of you will look at both of these and say, "Man, this really looks a lot the same to me." You'll notice on the cage starter system, there's no lighting inside the system. I really don't need uniform lighting, or it's not as important, uniform lighting in a cage rearing system, because I have complete control of where those birds are, the length of the system, and also in each tier of the system. And if you look on the right-hand side, we have lighting also inside the system. And the lights right now are only on in the middle tier on the right-hand side of this system because the birds are all in the middle tier. So when we place birds in the system, we place them all in the middle tier at the beginning. And then we open up the system as that bird develops and grows and is able to jump, then we let that bird out. But the aisle width is just as important as the system, and I'll explain a little bit of that further. So when you are planning a cage-free facility, if you have a system where you say you have a 4-row cage starter system, you may only want to put in 3 rows of a rearing system to give yourself more aisle space, because that aisle space is used for the bird, and it's also used for you as you're walking down. It's also used for lighting, ventilation, and bird movement. And we'll talk about that a little bit further. So let's look at we've got some 360 video that we're going to show of the mature cage-free rearing system. And every company that has equipment is selling a system kind of like this. We do some things different. Other companies do some things different, but it's like this. And a lot of you are thinking, boy, this really looks like a cage system. It starts out, the great thing about cages, if there is a great thing, we have the ability to control the birds when we need to. And so when they're young, when they can't jump from the floor into the system, when they're very little, we're able to keep them on in the system on cardboard so that we can add feed onto the cardboard if it's hard for a bird to reach in the feed trough. We're able to keep them in a controlled environment until we let them out. So if you look at these birds here, they're about 18 to 19 days old. We're going through and opening up the system to let these birds out onto the litter floor. So they'll come out of the middle tier, and then they'll jump back into the bottom tier. And this is kind of how we release birds when we fully open up the system. But this is where the aisle space really comes into play, because the wider the aisles that we have, or the enough aisle space, gives you better light uniformity. The incidence of the lighting hits into all of the tiers of the system, so we have uniformity of the lighting throughout the system. We have lighting inside the system, whereas in a cage starter we don't have light in the system. It's just in the aisle. But uniformity of lighting is critical so that birds don't. The problem with birds being able to choose is they have the ability to choose. So it can be an issue if you don't have uniformity, if you don't have ventilation uniformity. You want everything to be as uniform as possible, so that the birds really stay spread out in the system. If the birds group together, you create more competition for feed, for water, for perch space, for roosting at night. And it creates a competitive environment where the birds protect areas, and it causes more stress, which leads to, or can lead to, mortality from aggression. So even though the system looks a little like what you would see with the cage, it's really designed. The entire system is designed for cage free, to be opened up for perches. You'll see the outside perches on the outside. You have ramps and bridges to help the birds move up and down in the system. We slowly take out the ramps and bridges, especially if you have a system that these birds are going into that don't have the ramps. If we want the birds to be able to jump anywhere in the system, from the floor, from the bottom level up to the middle level, and then up to the top level. So we start them out to give every bird opportunity with bridges and ramps, and then we'll slowly start taking out the bridges. Once the bridges are completely out, we'll slowly start to take out the ramps, and it just it trains that bird so they're well equipped once they go into the layer facility.
I think that one of the things that I notice the minute I see these systems, and Bill talked about it a little bit, is the aisleways aren't just a place for inspection anymore. It's important that we see them as part of the system. The birds use this area. It's their scratch area. They jump down, they dust bathe, they have room to spread out in it, and it gives them room to move around. So it's really important that aisle width is the right width, that there's lots of room there. And Bill touched on the lighting and things like that, where it's a really big part of the system.
And that's why I bring up, when you have if you do have your own pullet rearing, which I know a lot of the customers in Canada, they get their birds from a contract pullet grower. So you have the ability to have a aviary reared pullet, or you don't, or you may think about raising your own pullets possibly. But if you're retrofitting a rearing barn, you need to plan that building out so that you get the best possible hen welfare, because you want the environment to match the environment that they're going to be going into once they get into the layer barn. So now let's talk about some of the management practices for rearing, and some of these will be for a cage reared bird and also a cage free reared bird. But I just want to point out some things that may be a little bit different. Again, feed consumption, it's going to be more. For a cage free bird, they're going to eat more simply because they're moving around much more than a caged bird. the rearing birds will be on perches. They'll move down to the litter. They'll be scratching, dust bathing. They'll be running up and down the litter aisle. They're going to consume more feed simply because they're burning off more feed. So your feed costs are going to be higher with cage free. And if you have organic, that's another level of feed costs that you need to at least know about and plan for. Also, feed schedules. I want to mention feed schedules here because even when we're talking about enriched birds, the management is more like cage free when we're raising birds to be enriched, and when that layer is in an enriched system, the management is more like cage free than it is like cages, because if we didn't care where the bird laid its egg in the system, because typically a bird lays its egg, it ends up onto the egg belt. But we don't want the bird, even in an enriched system, to lay the egg off of a perch or anywhere else in the system other than the nest, because it's the best possible ability for you to get a clean, good product out of your enriched system if they lay in the nest. We want the birds to use the nest, and they will, as long as you set up your management practices. And part of that is feed schedule. So a lot of times what we do with feeding, and I know that there are a lot of different management practices, and there is some very good people that are in Canada that are training people how to manage for enriched and also cage free. And every farm is going to be a little bit different. Every breed of bird is going to be a little bit different. Typically what we do with cage free and also enriched is we would have feed schedules right away in the morning, and then we would wait a couple of hours or a few hours before we feed again because we don't want to draw birds out of the nest area. So we're setting up our feed schedules so that in the rearing barn the same way, because that way the bird is used to it. They're trained. Once they go into the layer, there's less stress because they're used to that feed schedule. And I mentioned stress because in enriched and in cage free, the hierarchy changes. You have a much bigger bird group, so you don't have a despot hierarchy system anymore like you had in the cage system. You have a social order hierarchy, and that's why your management needs to change or adapt so that you're providing that bird with the best environment. Your light schedules are going to change as well. Typically in cages, you're going to have if you're dimming light or if you're decreasing daylight in the rearing system, or you're increasing daylight in the layer system, typically we would want to get to the off time first, and then we adjust our lighting on the front end. There's certainly different ways of thinking about that. From our experience, we want to get to the off time first, and then either add or decrease our light day in the morning hours. Your temperature, we do some different management practices with temperatures. Cages sometimes will, if we're trying to control egg size, for example, we may raise the temperature in the barn a little bit, maybe a degree or two, to try to get that bird to not eat as much feed, so that we can hold that egg size, or try to hold that egg size a little bit longer. If you have a market for, say, a medium egg or a large egg, and you're trying to control egg size, you have to be careful if you're going to do that, especially with the cage-free flock, because it will also affect stress in that bird. Anything that you do to stress the bird, or will will make another, well, it just leads to mortality in the end. So if you, for example, if I raise the temperature a couple of degrees thinking that I'm going to decrease how much that bird eats, you might have some of the birds eating less, but you'll also have some of the birds eating the same as they were before, because the birds have more opportunity to choose where they're going to be in the barn. And if the bird feels comfortable, they're going to eat more, and you'll create areas of ununiformity, which again leads to more opportunity for aggression, and which leads to higher mortality. Flock movement is I think one of the biggest things in enriched and also cage-free. But don't forget, in an enriched colony, we want to open up space in the system. Birds naturally will kind of group together because they feel comfortable in a community versus being alone. But that community opens up more space in the colony. So there's access to the scratch area. There's access to the nest, the way we do our feed schedules. We're opening up room in the system. There's perching in the system. So we want the birds to use the whole system and have the freedom to go anywhere in the colony that they want to go. Much the same with cage-free. If I walk into a barn and I notice that birds are idle in the system, I immediately think, okay, something is not right here. It could be I have a litter issue, wet litter. I could have a, which could also be a ventilation problem, or it could, a temperature problem that I need to be looking at. It also could be that you don't have enough feed schedules, for example. But the bird should always be moving. The better the flock movement, the less crowding you have, and the more opportunity that bird can go to where she wants to go. And that's really what we're looking for, even when we're setting up equipment, when we're designing equipment. But the aisle width, all of that leads to flock movement. And I know I'm just touching on this, but these are things that where the management is different, even with enriched and cage-free. And I'm sure there will be a lot of questions, and we'll talk more about that, but not just today. You can email Ron or myself anytime, and we will we'll get in touch with you.
Now, the main reason that all of our regulation to change is more space for birds. So we wanted to touch on the new Canadian regulations and just make sure everybody understood exactly what those regulations were. For example, in enriched space, we're looking at 116.25 square inches per bird. In cage-free, you're looking at 144 square inches per bird of space required. Nest space in the enriched colony system, looking at 10 square inches per bird. And in the cage-free system, we're looking at 12.9 square inches per bird. The perch space in both systems have to be a minimum of 5.9 square linear inches per bird. The dust space in the enriched system, you're looking at 120 square inches, or for every 25 birds, or 4.8 square inches per bird. And in the cage-free space, you're looking at 33% of the space must be litter space. That space is used for dust bathing, for movement, for getting down, and that's in that aisle space. What we thought we'd do and help people understand is we're looking at where we're at from what we have now are a conventional cage system to looking at what is required for both the cage-free and the new colony enriched systems. The conventional system, you're looking at about a 47-foot wide barn by 200 would give you about 20,000 birds. Now, that's ballpark. There might be a little bit different depending on what company you have for equipment and what system you use. But and that's 3 tiers. The aisle here are 3.1 feet wide, which is pretty conventional. But those aisles, remember, are used to transport people, to collect some eggs, fix some equipment, inspect birds. They're not part of the system. They're a place that us as farmers can walk around and see where we're at. If we look at a new system, we look at the enriched colony system, you get 20,000 birds in that same system. Because we need more space, the barn has to be a little bit bigger. We're looking at 50 feet wide and 260 feet long. And again, we're back to that 3.1 foot aisles, where those aisles are used for the same thing. So the cage is going to be bigger, there's more square inches per bird. And what that does is it allows us to meet the new requirements and put 20,000 birds in that barn. In the cage-free system, which is we use our NutriStep or Natura Step system for 20,000 birds. Again, we're 50 feet wide, we're 260 feet long, but you'll notice that the aisles are 6.8 feet wide. Those are what Bill was talking about when he was talking about that's it now part of the system, that those birds have access to that space, and that becomes part of their living environment. You'll notice there's only three rows of equipment, because the equipment and the aisles become their square inches per bird. So you need more space for the new systems because the birds are required to have more space. And that's what we would take the time to talk to you about, is each of your individual farms and your individual situations. We're going to watch a quick video that show the birds inside an enriched system. And what I'd like you to look at as we look here is the space that the birds have. They're in the nests, they're flocked together, but the space that's around them that allow them to move, that allow them to make choices on which side of the nest nest they're going to use. The movement from the perches to the dust bathing space and back to the nests. There's a lot of movement that these birds have over our conventional cages. They can walk along, they can go from the perch into the nests. They have a staging area that allows them to wait for a second before they get into the nest to lay an egg. So that's the big difference. So you can see that they're going in and out of the nests, they're moving around. That's what Bill was talking about with the social hierarchy in these nests, is now instead of having 8, 9 birds in a cage that are forced to live with each other, we have these birds that there's 70 of them that get to choose and have to have a social hierarchy inside that cage to decide who's the boss, who isn't, and their behavior reflects that.
It's a much calmer environment. You don't have birds always at the feeder. That you have birds in the nest, you have them on the perch, you have them in the scratch area. You know, when you look down an aisle, it's just not birds at the feeder playing with the feed, because that's what there is to do. These birds have a lot more opportunity to scratch, dust bathe, and be on perch, be in the nest area. More social, I would say, in an enriched type system. Yeah, so the next thing we're going to show is kind of what a Natura Step layer system would look like. You'll notice the wider aisle in this type of system, and we're going to I'm going to touch on the aisle width that I keep talking about and why that's so important. But notice in the system, the birds, the system is around 9 feet tall. It's actually a little bit less than that, but it's a vertical system. The birds have to be able to move from the floor onto the system, up to the nest level, and up to the top level of the system. We want the birds going up to the top to roost at night. That's where they naturally, that's where they will want to go as well. The system is designed to have them up there at night. There's only feed at the top. So a lot of the times when you're looking at equipment, there is some engineering that goes into these systems because of how the birds are going to interact with the system. We want the bird to use the nest to lay their egg. We want to create an environment that is designed for hen welfare. So when you're looking at the equipment out there that is available, look at the design, because there's a lot that goes into it. We don't have watering at the top of the system for the reason is we want that bird to come back down. We don't want the bird to stay up there in the morning. We want them to spread out because they will group together at night. You will come into your barn at night. There won't be any birds on the floor, and you'll feel like someone came in and stole half your flock, because there's a lot of area. The bottom level of the system will virtually be empty. They'll be mostly on the top tier of the system and at the nest level. So they'll group together in the morning. We want them to spread out the length of the system. So we run our feed in the morning. We have birds at the feed. We have opened up space for birds being able to go to the nest. We're creating area of movement by how the system is designed, but also how we're running and managing that system, walking the flock. So you'll see birds moving up and down. Most of our watering is at the nest level, and most of your systems, that's what you'll see. The bird will lay their egg and most likely come out of the nest and drink right after they get done laying, and then they'll move. Typically, they'll either move up or down to feed or down into the litter aisle to scratch and socialize with the other birds in the house. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good video. We do have all these videos available on our website. Yeah.
Some of the things that we need to look at, and for the enriched system, the systems are a little bit taller. The birds have to have, under the regulation, 17.7 inches from the floor to the top of the cage. So we need to make sure that when we're putting these in, it does take a little bit taller barn than some of the ones we've seen in the past. The enriched colonies have the additional things added to it. We have the perches, we have nests, we have scratch area. We also have staging areas in front of the nest for the birds to stand and wait. So these are things that are added to that extra space. The lighting is also really important in looking at the enriched system. Having the ability to adjust that intensity, having the larger spaces lit very well to the back of the cage, so that they use that area properly. We also need to really control the light in these cages. Well, with some of the new barns, newer barns we've seen that have put enriched in, they haven't got some light traps on some of the sidewall fans in the cross ventilation systems. And it's important that the nest area is dim. Like Bill said, we want to make sure that we're attracting those birds to the nests, that those eggs are laid in the nest, so that when they do, we don't have damaged eggs. We don't see cracked eggs. We see them as clean as we can make them. And then, well, all that means is better profitability for the farm. The bird behavior, again, you got to make sure that we understand that those are a larger group of birds, and it's a social group now instead of some of the other ways that we've seen in the past. Those birds are going to pick a leader. They're going to have a group and move in within that system. And the way we manage that is really important. That we, as when we're looking at our management, we're looking at the feed schedule, we're looking at the ventilation, we're making sure that all of these things work together to make sure that that system works well as a unit, and that we're adjusting to the new way of doing things. For example, the feed schedule, like Bill talked about, we're feeding one feeding in the morning, and then we're skipping a couple hours while those birds lay their eggs. So they're encouraged to go to the nest. They're not being interrupted and brought to the feeders by running the feed at that time in the morning. So we're allowing them to lay those eggs in the nest, and then we're feeding again after that. Okay.
Yeah, and you know, I really thought this presentation would take about 30 minutes, but it's already been 40 minutes. So, but on the cage-free side, again, where can I get? What is my access to pullets? If I have a floor pullet, maybe I put in a horizontal type cage-free system in that is better for those floor pullets versus an aviary type system. So just where am I? What is my access to pullets? Do I put an enriched system in because I'm going to have access to a cage pullet? That'll play a part on the decision that you make whether I go enriched or cage free. Again, you know, Ron talked about lighting. The ventilation is important. The only thing I would add is, you know, if you're retrofitting a barn, you may need to move where your fans are located because they may be directly across from a nest area in like an enriched colony where I'm trying to keep that area darker. So just look at everything. Look at your lighting in the aisle. Look at your ventilation. Then understand bird behavior and the hierarchy difference of either, for example, enriched or cage-free. Understand management practices and how my management affects how much I'm going to get out of my layer facility. The better your management, the better you're able to not react to what you're seeing, but be proactive in your management, the better you're going to be. So just when you're making your decisions, either enriched or a cage-free type system, it's more than just like cost per bird. Don't try to fit what you can get into a building simply because this is what I have quota for. So if I can get this amount of birds in this house, of course it's going to be it'll need to be looked at, because you need to look at everything as far as, you know, because you're going to need to it's going to have to pay for itself in order for you to make the decisions you're going to make. The only other thing I think we need to talk about is in your decision, look at where your eggs are going. And Ron, I don't know if you briefly want to talk about that.
I think that if it's important, one of the other things that's really important to understand is speak to your grader and see, do they have room for more cage-free producers and in their system? It's important that they become part of the discussion as well. We want to make sure that we're including everybody that has the ability to affect the farm's income to be involved in this decision. So we're hearing that we might not have much room left for some cage-free. So make sure that they become part of that decision. I think the other thing that I really wanted to mention quickly as well is part of this transition to cage-free and enriched. I know that, I don't know about the other companies, but I know that we have people like Bill that their job is to help that transition, to make sure that we're working with you to help you get through the transition to these new systems. We employ people at Big Dutchman, for example, that's their job, the bird behavioralists that go around and make sure that you can adapt to the system and point out some of the things we're talking about today and some of the smaller stuff. I can see we're running out of time.
The last thing we're going to talk about is, again, space, which is owl width. I have another whole presentation I could go over just talking about owl width and how important that is. It affects your lighting, your ventilation, your litter quality, which is a huge thing. It affects your flock movement, and affects how easy it is for you to manage that flock. Again, that's very brief, but feel free to email me, call me anytime to ask questions. And what I mean, Ron and I, or both, are more than willing. That's our job, to go to farms and work with the customer, consult with the customer to make the transition of going from conventional cages to make the choice to go enriched, or make the decision to go cage free easier for you. So anyway, that's really the presentation that we had for today. Thank you for joining us. Anna and Brett, thank you for having us. And again, if you have any questions at all, we can answer some now, but feel free to email or call. Get a hold of Ron, and we work closely together, and we'll get back to you for sure.
Thank you very much on my behalf as well. This is not an easy decision, and make sure you make it right. We're here to help. Okay, Brett.
All right, thanks a lot for that. That was great. So we have a few questions that came in beforehand. One is, how important is it to rear pullets in a cage-free system?
It's I don't want to say it's really important. It's critical that if you're using an aviary system, that the birds have the ability to move up and down. A vertical aviary system, for instance, if you have manure belts, for example, that those birds are used to running, that manure belt turning on and running, when those birds get over to a layer facility, they're going to be used to that manure belt turning on. They're not going to freak out when that manure belt turns on. If the bird is used to being on wire, they're not going to be scared of the wire once they go into a layer facility that has the wire flooring. And the movement is the key. If you're not in the barn and you have a Natura aviary rearing type system, or an aviary reared system, but you're not in there, you're still not going to get movement out of that bird, and they're not going to be ready for a aviary layer system. You have to be in the barn working with the birds. So you need to have the right type of system to rear the birds, but you also need to have the right type of management to make sure that those birds are moving.
And one of the things I notice, that if we walk around, we're out in the field and we see people that have cage-free systems that are having trouble adapting. One of the biggest factors we see is that the birds weren't reared in a aviary type system,
or there just wasn't enough time spent with the rearing birds. A lot of times it's all the time is spent in the layer barn. So like for example, a rearing barn gets built, the birds are placed in the rearing barn, and now during that time we have, say, 16 weeks to build our layer system. So those birds are are kind of left alone in that pullet facility because we're building the layer facility. And sometimes the pullets are forgotten about because we really didn't have to do a lot when we had a caged pullet. And the thinking is that, well, we don't need to do a lot with a cage-free reared bird either. So it's really important that a bird is raised in an aviary. It's not always the case that we get an aviary reared bird, but if not, it's always a floor raised bird that has to jump up to a water level. So we're making that bird jump slowly and higher as that bird gets older to reach water, which gives them at least the vertical ability to move. So
that's
I hope
I was just
that,
going to say, and some of the floor raised systems, something as simple as adding some high perches, and like you say, raising the water and making them jump for water and giving them the ability to perch in those rearing barns can make a big difference.
Okay, we had another question come in. So could you comment on the types of scratch pads for enriched cages? The turf mat type of scratch pads get dirty quickly and cause dirty eggs. However, there seems to be no alternatives in the market when it comes to scratch pads. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that comes back to that. There definitely is some situations where the scratch pad and the nest pads do get dirty and can cause some dirty eggs. I think if we come back to some of those things are caused by the lighting and by the ventilation, and they can have a rather large effect on those things staying clean or dirty. But there's definitely something to be looked at there.
the one thing I want to answer this question too. Sorry,
Yeah, go ahead.
But we have dirty scratch pads. So the thought is, well, I'm gonna just take the scratch pad out because I don't want a dirty scratch pad. The problem with doing that is, again, we're trying to get the bird to lay its egg in the nest. And again, in a enriched type system, if the bird lays anywhere in the system, the egg will eventually or hopefully make it to the egg belt. But we really want to provide an environment of hen welfare where the bird goes to the nest. And if we take the scratch pad out, there sometimes can be no reason for the bird to leave the nest after it's laid its egg. So having a scratch pad in there where we're adding some scratch material to the pad at a time of the day gets birds moving out of the nest to the scratch, which opens up nest space so that the birds aren't scratching and dust bathing in the nest area and just taking up space when we're trying to open up that space for the birds. So I'm a cage-free guy. That's kind of where I started when I started working with Big Dutchman. I like the scratch mat. To me, I have a whole floor of a barn that's a scratch mat that can get dirty. So I know it is a critical point of discussion on the size and the shape and how much it stays clean. But to me, it's really one of those things that it takes more management. It's something where it takes more to have an enriched system, where it's one of those things where it's really, I feel, is needed for the birds. I know that I'm not maybe the majority in the thinking on that, but if you don't have the scratch pad, I'm afraid that you would be taking up nest space, which would cause more birds to not use the nest, which would maybe cause more checks and cracks and a dirtier product. So that would be my answer to that, Brett.
Okay, we had another one come in. So if cage-free were ever to become mandatory, can the enriched cages be converted to cage-free style, or would you need to invest in a whole new system?
There are systems that can be converted from a enriched system to a cage-free type system. There are going to be some bit of a sacrifice when it is cage-free. Certainly if it's planned as a cage starting out, a full enriched system, I should say, starting out, because your aisle width will play into that. If it's a 3-tier system or if it's a 2-tier enriched system and you have nest, feed, water, scratch all on one level, and you have the same all on another level and all on another level, because birds in a cage-free environment can choose where they want to be, and the birds will choose to go to the top of the system at night, and I have feed and water and perch and nest in every level, then that bird, there's going to be no motivation for that bird to move out of that top area. So you run into issues with, or you run into possible issues, I should say, of distribution of where the eggs are laid, because you're going to get, if you have a 3-tier, for example, enriched system where you have nests in every level, you have every bird in that tier that's raised in that tier or starts out in that tier laying its egg in that tier. If I change that to cage free, that can be as high as 80% now laid in the top tier, where the system is designed for feed, water, nest, perch for 33% of the flock to lay up there versus 80%. So anytime you have an area of more than what the system is designed for, you have more competition. So it's a sacrifice. Your litter is going to be, your litter quality is going to be a sacrifice. 2-tier is much easier than 3-tier, simply because you have less birds once it's cage free. So we have seen some success with 2-tier systems, and we have quotes for 2-tier systems right now. We have quotes in for 3-tier systems too, but some of what we're doing in the planning is we're making the aisle widths wider. We are planning the ventilation, how it would be if it's cage free. This is how we want the ventilation to be to aid in the litter quality on the floor, what the system's like on the outside. So some of those things. So if you're planning to do that or want a system to do that, you really need to plan everything you can for the cage-free side for what the environment's going to be like once the birds are cage-free, which may be a bit of a sacrifice up front when they're enriched.
Yeah, I think
it's hard to do, but there is going to be a bit of a sacrifice in doing that.
we can make some of the equipment work, but like Bill said, the biggest thing you need to look at is that the aisle widths will change. You need to have that wider aisle width to make that part of your system now.
Okay, well, that's about all the time we have for today. You can send any other questions to Bill and Ron, or you can email them to webinars@annexweb.com. And just another reminder that a recording of this webinar will be emailed 24 hours after the live event. So thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.